Uh, Welcome, Professor Lukin. Do I have your permission to start this prestigious lecture?
Well, sure. You don't need my permission because India is a great country and it doesn't need anybody's permission.
No, it's very kind of you for this flattering remark, but your permission in the sense you are one of the most distinguished person in the field today. And when I say in the field today, I do mean in the whole world. Anyway, friends, I'm here very happy to welcome Professor Alexander Lukin, one of the most distinguished persons in the field of international studies. Professor Lukin is head of department of Higher School of Economics, Moscow University, which is one of the most prestigious universities in the world. And I think that one has to, if one wants to realize how important this university is, one has to really go and see it oneself. I have been fortunate enough to be twice in the department of Professor Lukin, and it is so impressive a work that is going on. More than that, Professor Lukin's own contributions are virtually monumental. To my mind, nobody else comes on the screen when I think of India, Russia, China, Far East, and also the Western world on one campus who can explain. And here on this canvas, only Alexander Lukin fits well. He can talk with the same authority about the USA, about the Europe, about Russia, about China, Far East, vis-a-vis India. So I'm very happy to welcome you, Professor Lukin. I don't want to spend too much time in describing you. Most of the people are very internet savvy. Most of people participating are very educated, and I'm sure that they must be knowing about you much more than I know or many of us know. And they have all great regards, and that is how the suggestion came that we should have a lecture from Professor Lukin in this great institution, Jawaharlal Nehru Memorial Museum and Library. So I don't want to stand between you and the audience. I invite you to please deliver your lecture, and the lecture has been explained to you by the office that it could be 35-40 minutes, and then we will have some time for question answer. And my only request to the people who will be asking questions that they should keep their questions short, and it should be question rather than a explanatory mark. Thank you for all, and here is Professor Alexander Lukin. The mic is yours, sir.
Thank you very much for inviting me to such a prestigious institution. It's a pity that I cannot go to India in person at this difficult time of the pandemic, but I hope I could go very soon. Unfortunately, I must warn you, I'm not an expert on India. Also, I like India and went to it, visited it on many occasions, and some of my books were even published in India. Because India, as I said, is a great country and it doesn't have or yet, I'm not sure, it doesn't have this kind of censorship as they have in England or the United States, where it's much more difficult to publish a reasonable book at the moment. But because I'm an expert on China, I may be speaking a little bit longer or more on China, Russia, and the United States than on India. Also, India is also a great participant, I would say, or actor on the international scene. So today's topic is the emerging multipolar world and the structure of international relations. Next slide, please. Yes. So if we look at history of civilizations, I would say, world history, of history of international relations. Sorry, that's a mistake. It should be world. So the world is naturally. We'll find out that the world is naturally multipolar. So most of the time, it was from the point of view of international relations, it was multipolar in terms of the system of international relations. There were several big centers of power within the international system. I'm not going to go into detail. You all know history better than me. But there was a period of bipolarity, which is not a usual period. We can say that it was, well, there were some bipolarity systems before, but it was not worldwide before that time, because the world was not so globalized as now. After the Second World War, there was a short period of bipolarity. So there were two major centers of power in the world, that is the Soviet Union and its allies, and the United States and its allies. And there were several specific reasons for that. First, the world became kind of more united and globalized, much more than before. There were already no separate or isolated civilizations or centers. There were only, for some period, only those two centers possessed nuclear weapons, for example. This was a major factor. And there were several other factors. And this bipolar system had several features, which some of them were more positive and some of them were more negative. So here I have those features. Yes, one is the control of major powers over large territories and their spheres of influence. So there were obviously two major spheres of influence. And but there was also kind of neutral space that was at that time called, well, like non-alignment countries or third world countries. And India, by the way, was one of them. And there were occasional conflicts on these neutral territories, like, for example, in Africa or Latin America, between the two major centers. But any local outbreak of in the third world turned into a standoff between the two main centers. That was a negative part of it, and people at the same time living in the countries and territories controlled by the Soviet center enjoyed very little freedom. Next, please. But there were also some, I would say, more positive traits of this system. The conflicts at that time were limited compared to the horrors of world wars, for example. And there were some rules of the game. Because some international rules existed at that time, and both the Soviet Union and the West, or the United States and its allies, showed their ability to find some consensus on them. And we have the examples of Helsinki Accords, that was 1975, and about a dozen nuclear non-proliferation agreements and arms control treaties, and so on. Next, please. However, after the collapse of one of the centers, that is the Soviet Union and the Soviet Power Center, this collapse was followed by what the West thought was its triumph. But however, the West seriously, as we understand now, the West seriously overestimated its power. And Western leaders lost much because of this overestimation, lost much of what they could otherwise have achieved. Next, please. So they pursued, I would say, a selfish policy towards non-Western world, which the essence of which was kind of achieving their goals only in the countries which are close to them culturally, such as Eastern European countries, or at least the majority of Eastern European countries, but they lost or they failed to attract to this unipolar system bigger countries, non-Western countries, such as Russia. Well, Russia is, of course, there's a great discussion about if it's Western or not, but let's call it half Western. And also, of course, such centers of power as China, and to a certain extent, India, Brazil, and others. And those non-Western centers were continued their growth. They were growing even before the collapse of the Soviet Union. And there were studies about the beginning of the formation of the multipolar world even at that time. But then when this unipolar moment or momentum came in the 1990s, most analysts or experts forgot about it. And there was this all kind of silly theories like the end of history and the like, that history stopped, ended, and now everything will be liberal, democratic, westernized, and there would be McDonald's, hundreds of them, or even thousands in every country. But the breakup of the Soviet camp did not affect other key tendencies in global development processes. And such non-Western centers of power as China, India, Brazil, and others continued to rise and become stronger. The relative role of the United States and the West in the world was diminishing, and those countries tried to solve their problems, non-Western countries, and protect their interests, at least near their borders. Next, please. Some of the Eastern European countries, which were formally formed the Soviet Center, unconditionally agreed to join the Western system and its junior partners. The new Russian authorities hoped at first in the 1990s for equal cooperation based on the common understanding of global development goals. The Central Asian republics feared the drive for Western-style democracy. Some of them were gravitating kind of more to Russia. Others tried to balance between Russia and the West, while others, like Turkmenistan, for example, had chosen autarky. Next, please. So this is the picture of collapse. However, the Western collapse of this center. However, the Western policy, I would say, foreign policy, became more and more ideologized. Those academic theories about the end of history became a kind of comprehensive type of ideology, very similar to communist ideology, which was dominant in the Soviet Union. I call this, also there is a book or a textbook like in the Soviet Union on this ideology, which I call democratism. There are still features of it which we can describe. So according to this ideology, the best way to integrate backward nations into the world of freedom, of so-called freedom and democracy, was to submit them to political influence through economic and political alliances. For this to happen, they need leaders who understand that this will benefit their countries, that is, Western-leaning countries, and who will therefore work towards this end. And even if these forces fall short of democratic standards, it will not be a big issue. Once they submit economically and politically, they will be pushed up to the required level with Western prodding or help. Next, please. So let's talk about several tenets or main points of this ideology. For example, you hear now very often the term liberal world order or the rules-based international order, which is basically the same thing, which is supposedly exist. And you hear about some countries whom sometimes are called rogue states, or countries that basically undermine this liberal international order, which are revolutionary forces or forces of instability for this international order. In reality, I would say that the liberal world order is a myth because it has never existed. And of course, no country can undermine a myth. Well, in reality, of course, you can undermine the myth in your mind, but not in reality. And I'm not alone in saying this. There were several articles in the West, for example, by Graham Allison, a famous professor from Harvard University, who wrote literally an article which is literally called The Myth of Liberal World Order. And why is it a myth? Because it's, what do we call a myth? In this case, it's not what, as Max Weber said, it's not what is, what should, but what should be. Well, Max Weber once said that social science should separate talking about what is and talking about what should be, according to your plans. So the liberal world order is not what actually exists, but what, according to Western ideology or American ideology, it's an ideal world that should exist sometime in the future. It's like communism, like in I lived under communism for a long time, about 30 years in the Soviet Union, and we had textbooks about the future world society, which was called communism, when everyone would be equal, there will be no private property, and everyone would work, according to their abilities and get from the society whatever they like. Of course, it's a very strange utopian thing which did not exist and cannot exist in the first place. So the liberal world order is the same type of construct, and what does exist in reality? The real world system is still based on the rules which are actually on the system of international law, which was created by countries winners of the Second World War by consensus. And this is an international system. Of course, it's not ideal, and some rules are not always implemented, but at least we can talk about some rules and some principles of it, especially in some specific areas like maritime law or several others. But when we hear the rules-based international order, we don't know what rules they are. If you ask, say, American or British professor, you are talking about rules-based international order. Name me one rule, specific rule. And they would never answer you. Because if they answer you, it would turn out that their country undermines this much more than any other Western country. Yeah, for example, the principle of territorial integrity, or you name it. So they would never tell you specifically about what specific rule they have in mind. Next, please. So I think that the West will gradually change, and while democratism adapts to new realities, the West can hardly bear so. But while this I would say process or time of adaptation, period of adaptation to new realities, multipolar reality, is very dangerous because and during this time, the West can hardly bear a source of peace and stability. The main source of conflicts will be, and already is, it will be the attempts to impose the ideology of democratism on the population, which is not willing to accept it. Well, the Afghanistan, for example, take the Afghanistan situation. This is a very good example of it, when Americans, and before that the Soviets, and before that the British, tried to impose the values and this political system of their own, what they thought was an ideal political system, but on a society which completely rejected it and did not even understood what they mean. You see, now we have a total mess there, and actually the political system there went back like more than 100 years ago. Next, please. So Russia was one of the first to revolt against this ideology and the foreign policy Western based on it. And the main historic event was the crisis in Ukraine in 2014, which actually expedited Russia's refusal to follow the West and led to a serious confrontation with it. Before that, Moscow always made strategic concessions in the end. There were some conflicts, Georgian conflict, for example, 2008, and in Yugoslavia before that. But today, such concessions are highly unlikely, and only tactical agreements can be possible. Russia has lost faith in the United States and Europe as political and economic partners, and realized that it cannot establish friendly relations with them without its complete political submission, which Russian political elite cannot afford. So from that time, Moscow has begun an actual political and economic turn to non-Western world. Next, please. So another country, or probably the most important country here, is China, and people are talking about China's rise. I know that there are mixed feelings, I would say, in India about China. So we are going to talk carefully about it. So in the long term, a rising China will be a much bigger challenge to the Western ideology of global dominance than Russia. And why is that? Because Russia is not such a strong country at the moment. It's kind of still strong politically, but not very, and militarily, but not very strong economically. While China poses a threat, not because of its military power, or less because of its military power. Its military power is highly exaggerated in the West, but because it's built an effective and attractive economy that is not based on the Western political model. And this is much more dangerous for the West, as it causes doubt in fundamental postulate that economy can be only effective and generate prosperity if a country accepts the Western, let's say, political system. The Soviet Union failed to do that. And that's why I think that was the main reason for its collapse, because it was not economically effective, and it failed to create an economic alternative to Western society. But we see now that the West depends on China economically just as much as China depends on the West. So the serious decoupling, as people now say, would be very difficult for both centers of power, and the relations will be much more complicated than just decoupling of just economic decoupling. Next, please. So when we are talking about China's future, we should take into account several positions, I would say. Well, the experts in the West usually argue that China is a case of the theory of modernization, which basically says that economic development leads to creation of middle class, and middle class leads to democratization. At certain point, the emergence of middle class and certain level of prosperity. So that economic modernization should lead by democratization, just like in South Korea and Taiwan. But Chinese experts, well, official Chinese experts usually reply that China's mere size is so different that China is a separate civilization, and it is not developing according to any Western scheme. This is, I cannot tell you if it's correct or not, because nobody could tell you. But there are some considerations that things in China may take a different path, because we can, when we analyze democratization in other countries of the region, such as South Korea or Taiwan, which is not exactly a country, or de facto country, let's say, we can say that this democratization, which is like accepting Western political model, took place while those countries were basically allies of the West, and the West dominated in the world. China is not an ally of the West, and the world is not dominated by the West anymore. So the situation is different. And also we have, for example, an example of Singapore, which has not yet democratized, and probably would never do, we don't know that, but it's a very effective society and economic model. So whether China becomes a big Taiwan or a big Singapore, we don't know. But even democratized China would probably not look up to the United States or anyone else, because it's just too big and a proud country, and its policy and the United States policy, or China would probably never give up its interests. In fact, anti-American and anti-Japanese sentiment is much stronger in Chinese society than in the country's leadership. So if, let's say, opposition comes to power in a very unlikely event, or the population would have more say than in today's China, it does mean that it will make the country more pro-Western. It actually can make China less pro-Western. Next, please. So about the future of China, there were also several theories. Like one American important scholar, David Shambaugh, said that came out with a China collapse theory based on this modernization theories and so on. But I think, is most likely wishful thinking. The Chinese system of power may face serious complications or even a crisis in a relatively distant future due to economic problems, but we don't really know whether it's going to happen or not. In any way, the experience of the Soviet Union and Russia shows that even a hypothetical collapse of communism and drawn-out crisis can hardly lead to its westernization. Next, please. We skip this. Next, please. So we also have other countries. China and Russia, of course, are not the only countries which could become centers of world influence with their own concepts. Here is India, of course, with its interesting concepts of cooperative pluralism or union in diversity, which, as far as I know, some Indian experts want to be applied not only to internal Indian society at home, but also as a model for international community, that saying that Indian society is very plural, has many religions, many ethnic groups, and they all cooperate more or less well. So it would be nice if the international society would be also based on these factors. And this is very, very different, despite that India is, as some people say, the biggest democracy in the world. It does mean that its foreign policy would necessarily be westernized. Now, this is very, very different from the Western idea of that everyone should in the end accept Western political model, and if you don't accept it, you should be under sanctions, for example. Brazil has an interesting is another interesting country, a very big and important country, and its major political foreign policy theory of autonomy that which basically says that India, there are different interpretations there, to my knowledge, but the main idea is that it should basically be an independent country and keep an independent stance in the world. Next, please. We also see the tendency of consolidation of non-Western centers. And why do we see this tendency? Because the collapse of the Soviet Union left a kind of vacuum, and worries emerged in many countries about instability in the international situation resulting from this collapse. First, the end of bipolar system that had guaranteed a certain order, and now this order was not there. And another source of concern was the possibility that one remaining center of power might encroach on the interests of others. So disgruntled states have begun building bridges between each other. Next, please. And here we can see the emergence of groups or organizations which are organizations which unite non-Western countries, and they are like they are growing in the world, and their influence in the world is growing. This is the result of this process. One of them is BRICS, which India is a member, or let's say a part. Next, please. Another is Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which was joined recently, a couple of years ago, by India. And this year, Iran became also, or at least they started a process of including Iran. Next, please. So the current international system, because of all these processes, I would say could be called post-bipolar system. And here are some features of it. In a multipolar world, the influence of Western center, or the Western center of power will diminish, and it is gradually diminishing now, while that of other centers, like I said, China, India, Brazil, and others, will grow. And new centers of power will try to create zones of influence around their borders by snatching influence from the West. In the West, they call this spheres of influence, and they're supposedly against the spheres of influence because it's unfair to smaller countries. But in effect, what they mean by that is that the entire world should be a sphere of influence of the West, of the United States. So these stronger countries, these strong new centers of power, of course, think for themselves that this is unfair to them. And I think that creation of such zones of influence would be an inevitable process around them. We also see it on the examples of China, India, or several other countries. And this policy will be fiercely resisted by the West, as is now the case with Russia and China. Weaker non-Western centers of power will try to coordinate their actions against the most powerful center. Of course, in the ideal multipolar world, all centers should be equal, but this is only a pure model. But in reality, the Western center is still the strongest one, and that's why it is natural that other centers tend to cooperate to balance its power from the realistic point of view. So if the zones of influence of non-Western centers of power collide, conflicts may erupt between them, even between non-Western centers, and we see it, for example, in the case of China and India now. The West, especially the United States, may use the struggle in its own interests by creating alliances with some non-Western centers against others. And because of its complexity, a real multipolar world with several more or less equal centers of power may not be so inevitable. Next, please. There are also, of course, in the world, not only large actors, but smaller actors, medium or regional centers of power with their own goals and regional policy views, such as Vietnam, South Africa, Nigeria, Venezuela, for example, will also play an important role in this new system. They can form temporary alliances with larger centers of power in order to achieve some local goals. For example, take Vietnam, for example. It was a great arch enemy of the United States for a long time, had a long war with the United States, but now it's kind of friendly, politically friendly with the United States, just because of its feeling towards China. And this is, we see a typical win of, I would say, rationalism over ideology. So, but at the same time, I don't think that the post-bipolar world will fall apart completely into big and small centers of power, because there will still be it will still face same or even more acute global problems that can only be solved jointly, like a shortage of resources, overpopulation, pollution, non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. Well, the pandemic, we can say, is also a very good example. And terrorism, of course, will continue to pose a deadly threat to mankind as a whole, not just separate countries. Next, please. The resolution of these problems will require a mechanism of interaction. It can be created of the main centers of power, if the main centers of power come to some kind of consensus on the limited area where their views converge and kind of agree to disagree on all other issues, and agree to avoid sharp confrontation. This was possible even during the bipolar world, US-Soviet confrontation, because, as I said in the very beginning, there was some rules, despite the fact that there were also serious problems. So you don't have, in this system, you don't have to like your, let's say, counterpart or opponent, if you wish, and you can disagree and engage in all kinds of, criticism, but at the same time you accept that they also have a right to exist and certain interests, and you should not, and that your kind of confrontational criticism should not lead to a war, because the war would be deadly for everyone. This will essentially revive the notion of peaceful coexistence that was part of the bipolar world. Meanwhile, while not sharing global development goals or social system ideals, big players should refuse to wage, in this system, should refuse to wage wars against each other and try to come to agreement where agreement is possible. Next, please. So existing global governance institutions, such as the United Nations and its Security Council, would be the best choice for the working bodies of this mechanism, as they simply don't have any alternative. This does not mean, of course, that this system should not be changed, it is, of course, as we all understand, is not ideal and has a lot of problems, but it should be gradually reformed by mutual consent in order to ensure more adequate representation of the growing centers of power. So what's going to happen if we all, representatives of different centers and civilizations, are not wise enough to come to this kind of system? So I would say that the only alternative to this would be an unpredictable world with no rules, where all fight against all, and that would be very dangerous. Next, please. So thank you very much for your attention. I'll stop here. It's about 40 minutes, I think, 35 minutes maybe.
Thank you very much for this very enlightening lecture on a very vast canvas. You covered an area right from bipolar words history and coming down to multipolar. You are very, shy, or you are very modest in saying that You are not an expert on India, but I know personally about your writings on Indian and other political regions. But if in bipolar world or even otherwise, India did not have a great place because we were not being counted properly, except in last few years or last a decade or so, we have started being counted. And that is why slowly we are gaining a position worldwide. It will take little more time perhaps, but you have given a very vast canvas lecture taking right from USA to China and also Western world and taking down to Nigeria and all these places, how whole thing can be looked at. And I like your concluding sentence that situation should not arise where we should be all fighting with each other all the time. That has to be avoided. With these words, I would like to open the picture for questions. And I did see a couple of people having written the question on the screen, but I could not read that. So can I ask, this is, हाँ हाँ जरा सा आप पढ़ के बताएं कामी अच्छा कमेई सेंसर है अपने आके हैं yes Mr. Samson, can you please ask the question because we can read it, you can always ask in person.
Yes sir, can you hear me sir?
Yeah.
Can you hear me sir? Hello.
Yeah, go ahead. Yes, yeah. I can
hear you.
Yeah. Your question. So no
yes,
Professor,
so
you
yes,
Professor Lukin, you can hear the person asking question.
Yes, I can.
Right.
Yeah. Thank you, sir, for giving me this opportunity to ask question. So, in your talk, you mentioned that waste is not a source of peace and stability now. So, in this context, we all are witnessing the growing significance of India in the West. So, in this context, where do you see India is headed to by coming closer to the West, when West is no longer a source of peace and stability, according to you?
Okay. Well, of course, China is a very important, growing China is a very important factor for India. As I said, I'm not an expert on Indian internal politics, but as I understand it, India, from this point of view, from the point of view of growing China, some kind of cooperation between India and the United States and its allies is quite reasonable from the realistic point of view, I would say. But at the same time, this is not the only trend in Indian policy, because it's acting out its own interests, and it has also other interests. It cooperates with Russia, for example. It has its interests in Central Asia. It has its own interests around its borders. So I don't think that India will ever join any kind of Western alliance. It will, moreover, in the future, I think India will become more and more more and more independent in its foreign policy, and we can see this process. It will going to use or act according to its own interests, of course, but its policy will be, I would say, in the future will be first more active, and second, I would say, very diversified. So the West and the United States cooperation with the West is pragmatic. It's not that it likes, well, it will want the West to impose its values on India or its, say, political system. So It's kind of just pragmatic, very pragmatic policy of balancing China. But if the situation changes, it also may change. So I would not say that, as you said, the role of the West is growing, but it's growing in only one aspect. It's probably the West is probably losing its influence in India in many other aspects, I would say. Thank you.
Anyone next, please. Any other participant wants to ask any question to Professor Lukin?
Sir.
Okay, Professor Lukin, no question is coming forward.
Sir, can I ask one more question?
Yeah.
So this is Samson. So this idea of democratism, will you say that this is an antithesis of the late 19th century, yellow peril of the West?
I didn't hear it very well. Could you?
Yeah, I'll repeat again, sir. I'll repeat again. Your idea of democratism, under which the West is trying to spread the values of democracy in other parts of the world. Would you say that this democratism is an antithesis of yellow peril that happened in the late 19th century?
It's not necessarily yellow peril. I would say it's colonialism in general. But I can say that these are all both a Western ideology of colonialism, the white man's burden and and the like, is just another form, and the ideology of democratism is just another form of I would say Western ideology of supremacy. They are trying to impose, at that time they were trying to impose their political will and political system on others. I mean, during the colonial period, as they understood it at that time, and they did it as they thought, for the good of other people. The results were not very good, but they thought that according to this ideology, they do it for the good of other people. Now they impose other forms, whatever they think is best for other people at that point of time. And this is not only Western way of doing. Any big power, or many big powers did that. China, for example, also imposed its forms for a long time, the so-called cynic world, during thousands of years. That's why when China experts go to Korea or Japan, they see that still there are many Chinese kind of forms of government there, and forms of thinking, Confucianism and the like. So this is not very specific to the West. But the thing is that in contemporary world, if the world is based on this kind of policy of imposing of others, if you think that you know better for other people than these people know themselves, it will lead to a terrible conflict. Like, as I said, in Afghanistan and Syria and Iraq, you have to accept, even if you don't like what people do, you have to accept that you cannot do anything about it. You cannot really change it. If you try to change, it will be even worse for them and for you. So let the stupid people live as they like, basically.
Now, can I call Mr. Bardashambos? Can you introduce yourself before putting the question, please?
Sure. I'm Varada. I'm junior fellow at Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, and I teach at NLU Mumbai. So, Professor, thank you for this thought-provoking presentation. Uh, since we are talking about multipolarity, I would just like you to reflect a bit upon uh, how do we look at non-state actors in this multipolar world, whether it is big corporate giants or whether data giants or even something like terrorist groups, and the way we are looking at Taliban. So how do we see the multiple non-state actors that are taking shape, and where do we see the location of nation state as such in this multipolar world? Is the state itself diminishing, or is the state becoming much more stronger, in your opinion? Thank you.
Well, it is. Well, the roots of this question, I would say, is the theory of liberalism. Well, I mean, foreign policy or international relations liberalism, which has claimed for a long time that so-called non-state actors are becoming very important, or even more important than the states. In fact, this is the part of Western ideology, because if history ended, the sovereign states should play less power because there is a center of power which tells them what to do. And there are many theories supporting this idea, like responsibility for protect, for example. This theory, this concept. But in reality, and basically we are seeing it now very clearly during the pandemic, that sovereign state still has a great role. Whenever there was a serious international, challenge, everyone acts within their national borders. The borders were immediately closed, and we even cannot go freely to another country. It does mean, of course, that non-state actors don't play any role. They still play important role, whether in the terrorist case it's a negative role, or in some cases positive role, like various international organizations, charities and so on. But I don't think that they are going to take the place of sovereign state. We see now very clearly that this system that was, well, if we go back in history, the Westphalian system, if we are talking about 20th century, say the system of international law based on United Nations, the basis of which were sovereign states. So you know that the very term United Nations, here we see nations in the English meaning of a nation, which is a state. Yes, and in the Russian language, for example, a nation is an ethnic group, but not a state. So we translate it in a different way, or we translate it in the wrong way, I would say. So United Nations is a union of sovereign states. So I think the sovereign state would continue to play an important role, more important role than international actors, non-state actors.
Thank you, Professor.
Anyone else? Well, Professor, there does not seem to be any other question coming. Is there any? No. Can I put it two very small questions to you? May not be directly associated with the lecture you gave, but definitely somewhere you have deep understanding of the things, two countries, both Russia and China. My first question is that both China and Russia were under one kind of regime ideologically. Where did the Russia fail and it collapsed, whereas China made a very successful transition from communist regime to capitalistic ideology and the economic development, which Russia missed? what could have been the reason? And number two is, in bipolar world, Russia and America were there, but there was one very fundamental thing common to both. They did not think of usurping the territory, usurping the nation, it's other things. They tried to help in Russian bloc. Russia had been in its own, they helped various countries. America did this. But with China, there is one continuous fear, and that fear is proving to be true, that in whichever country it is helping, it's trying to usurp their resources, their various kind of industries, their ports, and Pakistan is example, Sri Lanka is example, and also there is a kind of threatening situation where expansionism word is being used in the context of China, whereas blocks were very different in time of Russia and America. So how do you feel about both these issues?
Well, the first is an interesting question, that why the Soviet Union failed. And I basically think that this is, well, partly you can explain it from history, but partly the Soviet history could have gone a different way, and many things were dependent on personalities. And specifically that Stalin came to power. And I'll tell you why. Because within communism or communist Marxism, or I would say Soviet-style Marxism, because Chinese communism at first was also Soviet-style Marxism, there are several tendencies. And I would call them, let's talk about three tendencies. I would call them left communism, right communism, and bureaucratic communism. So in the Soviet Union, when Stalin came to power, bureaucratic communism won. And the bureaucratic communism, the idea of Stalin was that you control everything bureaucratically. The ruling class of Communist Party and communist bureaucrats should control everything. And the very idea of private property was thought as very dangerous, because if you have private owners, this kind of undermines your control. There was a right-wing tendency in the Soviet Communist Party, but it was suppressed by Stalin. While in China, the right-wingers, within the communist right-wingers came to power in Deng Xiaoping. First, the leftists came and they created a terrible disaster. Mao Zedong was a left communist, I think. But then, when Deng Xiaoping came to power, they basically recreated the traditional, under communist slogans or ideology, they recreated the traditional Chinese system, like with some role of private property in certain sectors of economy, strong and also strong role of the state. And this worked in China very well. And it actually worked very well every time these people came to power. It worked in the 1950s there, but then Mao Zedong stopped it. Then it worked in the early 1960s, and then it worked and developed for a long time. So if people, I'm not sure, if everyone would know all these names, but people like Bukharin and the like came to power in the Soviet Union, like rightists, like right type of communism, right-wing communism. The Soviet Union could have developed very differently, but they failed. And when Gorbachev came to power, he just didn't understood where he was, and the whole thing just collapsed. He was a very strange person. believed in, common ideals for humanity, and the Americans just cheated him. So this is the reason. And the second question was about the evilness.
Expansionism, and people,
Yes,
many countries fear that China is usurping their resources and their things.
Well, yes, this tendency in China is actually growing now under Xi Jinping, because Xi Jinping basically abolished the policy of Deng Xiaoping, the so-called modest type of policy that China should not be behave as a great power and so on. And this is, on the one hand, is natural because it became very strong and very strong economically. It needs foreign markets and so on, but also ideologically. Well, what can I say about it? China, every big power is very egoistic, and nobody says that China is a benign power and is going to, help everyone and not pursue its own interests. But one should understand it. But I wouldn't say at the same time that it is, exceptionally egoistic. I mean, if you compare China with the United States is much more egoistic, and it's much more warrior state than China. China has never just yet be in a war with anybody since 1980. And of course, everyone says that it has a big military, but the fact is that they did not use it for like 40 years. Maybe they are going to use it at some point, but we don't know that.
Hope they don't.
Yeah, right. Also, by the way, the Chinese army has never been very strong. I mean, they lost most of the wars in history. But anyway, I say, if we are talking about India, well, you should understand that China is a tough and egoistic country, but it doesn't mean you cannot deal with it. I mean, if they have any interest, they don't want to sacrifice their power or strength, and you can talk to them very well, and Russia is talking to them, for example, quite well.
Thank you, Professor Lukin, for this wonderful lecture, and we are delighted to hear this lecture on a very vast canvas. Again, I received very vast canvas, and that shows that how deep learning has gone into this academic career. We wish all the best of that. And with these words, I'm looking forward to more of it in person in Delhi, sometime hearing you. And with these words, I wish that situation arises much earlier than we can think. And many thanks again for sparing your time and speaking to us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Hope to see you again. Bye-bye.